Today's text will focus on the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. That is in Matthew chapter 26, Mark chapter 14, Luke chapter 22, and John 18. I will probably, for simplicity's sake, remain mostly in Matthew. So that'd be Matthew 26, verse 36 and following. That way you're not, I'll just go ahead and be honest. There are minimal differences between the Matthew and the Mark account. Luke's account is different, but the main difference there is you have an angel who shows up. And then John's account is he went to the garden, 18 verse 1, across the Kidron Valley. That's about all that John gives us in this account. So that's kind of where we're going to be at today. I don't know how long we'll last, but we'll go until we're done, and then you'll have a few minutes to catch up on your conversations and stuff at the end of our discussion today. Let's open up with some prayer requests, though. Are there any that we need to be mindful of in prayer today? I do know your bulletin will have a couple of people, but are there others that we probably need to be mindful of? By the way, for all transparency's sake, I did not grab a bulletin, but the Lord knows who they are.
Josh, I got a text from Diane this morning.
Yes.
That Ralph is on the way to Audubon. He's not doing well. Audubon? On his way to Audubon.
So I want to keep Ralph and Diane Holbrook in your prayers.
Josh?
Yes, ma'am.
Jerry's going to have his third surgery on that Wednesday.
Okay. Are they hoping that this will fix the blurriness?
Well, they're hoping they're fixing it so he can see. You know,
Yeah.
the retina's trying to detach again.
Okay. So Jerry on Wednesday is having eye surgery.
And
Any others? Any online? Anyone we need to be mindful of online? Feel free to chime in. If not, let's have a moment of prayer. Our Father who's in heaven, holy and perfect is your name. It's a name that is above every other name. And I know that the name you give to Jesus is the name that every knee will bow to. In your perfect nature and your complete holiness, Father, we in sinfulness are nothing but scum. I know that we know that had it not been for the sacrifice that you put in place through Jesus Christ, that not a one of us would be worthy of anything. Father, thank you for loving us enough to want us as part of your family, to want us as your children, to want us as much as you do. I don't understand. I don't understand what about humanity, what about people is worthy of the sacrifice that you put in place. But Father, for that sacrifice, we are so very thankful. That Father, in moments where we talk about sickness, in moments where we talk about death, the pain of leaving our family and our loved ones in this world hurts. But Father, in moments like this, we can also talk about the joy of the resurrection and what we look forward to because of the love that you've shown towards us. Father, for Ralph and for Jerry, in each of their respective cases. And Father, for the people who are listed in our bulletin, you know those names. For the people who we haven't even mentioned, who our minds have forgotten or have lapsed in this moment, Father, you know what's going on. Father, help us to have the confidence in you to know that you are already providing responses in each of those cases, that you are ever present in those moments. God, ultimately we ask for this world to be done away with and for your reign, your kingdom to be established here as it is in heaven. I don't know what that looks like, Father. So I may not even know fully what I'm asking for, what we ask for, and what Jesus taught us to ask for. But Father, whatever that looks like, help us to be a part of it. Help us to embrace it, and help us to long for it. Today, Father, as we study from your book, may we learn something about Jesus, about the disciples, but may we also learn something about ourselves. This is our prayer through your Son, Jesus, the Holy One that we pray. Amen. Okay, so as we begin, we will be in Matthew chapter 26, verse 36 for the primary focus of today. Like I said, I would encourage you to scan over the other texts at your own convenience. That's Mark 14:32, Luke 22:39, and John 18, verse 1. So I would encourage you to do that at your own leisure. However, for today's account, Matthew 26, verse 36. We come to this garden moment, and in verse 36, it says that Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said, "Sit here while I go and pray." In Luke's account, in Mark and in John's account, Mark and John both make a point to saying that it was a customary action for Jesus to go to this garden. So this was not a foreign location for Jesus. This wasn't a place that he was unaware of. This was a very well-known place for him. It was a well-known place for his garden, or for his time away from Jerusalem, which then lends us also into, I believe it's John's account, where Judas brings the crowd to the garden. Well, how would Judas have known where Jesus was at? Except he probably knew, oh, well, there's a certain tree, and you turn left at the terebinth tree, you walk 5 paces, and Jesus is typically going to be camped there. So Judas was well aware of the area as well. So as we enter into this scene, Jesus is in a place that is already known. The disciples are in a place that is already known. We're outside of the city of Jerusalem at this point, not a very far walk, but we are outside, really at the base of a small mountain. In my account, it wouldn't even be fully considered a mountain, but I like mountains that are tall. It's an oversized hill in the Josh Watkins perspective, but it would probably be like some of our hills just south of here, to a place called Gethsemane. Gethsemane means oil press by definition, or it comes from the Aramaic word for oil press. That being interesting because we're at the base of the Mount of what? Does anyone know? The Mount of Olives. We're at the base of the Mount of Olives, so it would in some way make sense that a person would pick olives, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure it out. Would you rather carry a box of olives uphill or downhill? Downhill. And so it makes complete sense that someone who is smart enough would say, well, I'm going to put my olive press at the base of the hill so that I don't have to work too hard, so I can carry my olives down the hill. However, I want you to think about the name oil press a little differently. How do you extract oil from an olive? By pressing it. In this Garden of Gethsemane, is the name somewhat symbolic to what happens to Jesus? That in this moment, he too is being pressed. Which lends us even to the idea that comes, and we'll talk more about it in a moment. Actually, we'll talk about it right now. I believe it's Luke's account that talks about Jesus sweating what?
Drops of blood.
Drops of blood. There's a scientific term for this. I can't pronounce it. So if you're a doctor and you want to try and go at it, you're welcome to. But hematidrosis. That's the tridrosis, whatever it is. There's a scientific term for it. And it is a very plausible medical condition that does happen to people. The interesting thing to me, and there's actually, I mean, if you start searching a little bit, you don't have to search very far. There's bleeding from the eyes, bleeding from the ears, bleeding as sweats of blood. But the interesting thing is when you go to look at this particular sweating drops of blood medical condition, doctors don't have a known reason for it. It's such a rarity that we don't know much about it. However, doctors hypothesize that it is related to the fight or flight response in man. What does that tell us then, maybe we're hypothesizing for a moment, what does that tell us about Jesus in this moment as he's praying?
Stress.
Stress.
Intense stress.
Overwhelmed.
I told you we're outside the city of Jerusalem, so there's no perimeter defenses that's protecting a city at this point. You're pretty much, you're kind of in the suburbs, if you will. Just over the hill, you enter into desert, or you slowly enter into desert. Not that there's not neighboring towns. You know, Jesus is probably 9 miles from a nearby town at this point. How easy or possible would it have been for Jesus to have just jumped over the hill and into the desert? I find it interesting that in a fight or flight response, the stress and the agony that is oppressing him at this moment is so great that he chooses to stay and fight. If you continue in the medical field, they'll say that this medical condition should be treated with an antidepressant, an anti-anxiety medicine, or blood pressure medicine. Yet again, I think showing the stress that Jesus is under at this moment. Jesus, and this is in Matthew 26, verse 37. He tells the disciples, the greater group, and by the way, there are probably more than just the 12 here, but he has at least the 12 traveling with him. He says, you stay here, and then verse 37 says that he took Peter, James, and John, the two sons of Zebedee, along with him, and he began to be sorrowful. He began to be even more troubled. And he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. I want to come back to the disciples in a moment. And Jesus goes on in verse 39. He says, a little way further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not what I will, but as you will. Jesus enters into this prayer. What do you notice in the prayer given, verse 39?
It's like the prayer he taught us to say. Your will be done.
I'm gonna trust that. I don't know if people here online could hear Chris. I know Greg's got it closer to a microphone, but Chris made the comment that he went straight to the source, to the only person who really could do anything about this. What I find, I want to come to Greg's comment now too, is he comes to this prayer with the desire to discover what God wants. and there's not a moment of selfishness, or actually, I should rephrase it. There is a moment of selfishness here. Who wants to experience what the cross is going to bring? No one. And Jesus, in whatever state he's in at this moment, is showing us that that's not what he wants on his own will to do. Father, if there is any other way, back in the temptations, Matthew chapter 4, Satan offers Jesus what I think is a way to avoid the cross. When he takes him to the top of a high hill, and he says, everything that you see, I'll give it to you if you bow down and worship me. I perceive that as a time when Satan was offering Jesus the opportunity not to go to the cross. And if that's true, would there be other ways? Let's think for a moment. Is it possible for God to snap his godly fingers and to solve the problem of sin? Is it possible that God could say, instead of my son as a sacrifice, sins can be atoned by whatever else? Is it possible that there could have been another way?
This point in time, I don't think it could have been. Because everything in this school, day one, story. If the process had continued.
You know, I like to believe, and Chris, I think you're right on. By the way, if you couldn't hear Chris, it was, what do you do with the entirety of the Old Testament if there's another way? I like to think that God could have snapped his mighty, powerful fingers and could have solved the problems. And I'm not going to say that God's so limited that he couldn't have. I think at this moment, if God had said, look, we're going to solve this, I can rewrite history, I can do all those kind of things. I think God could do that. However, what do you do with all the history? What do you do with the fact that Christ came in the form of a man for this purpose, from the foundations of the earth, that this was what he was called to do? And in his prayer, he says, not my will, but yours be done. What does that say to you? That phrase. What does that say?
That his Father's will was more important than his will.
Do we ever struggle with that?
Sure.
You couldn't hear Laura, but the Father's will is greater than Jesus's will, his will. Do we ever struggle with that? And maybe our struggle comes even before the ask. Maybe our struggle comes in the moments where we say, well, this must be God's will because this is what I want. This would be the most convenient. This would be the easiest. But notice in this moment, Jesus comes to this moment fully knowing what lies ahead of him, pleading and begging for God to give him another answer. And the answer is still, you're going to go to the cross. Mark's account, Jesus uses the phrase, Abba, Father. And that idea, the idea of Abba being kind of as a child would call to a father. It's a more endearing term. But notice that at the very end of our account, when we come down to verse 46, this is Matthew 26, verse 46. Notice Jesus has finished the prayers. He's finished the conversation with the disciples. And at 46, he says, rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. This was the moment where Jesus had the power, the ability, the freedom to jump over the mountain, run off into the desert, and never to be found. Judas would have had no idea where he went. They would have started to search for him, but let's be honest, Jesus disappeared in crowds of people. He could disappear again. But notice that at the conclusion of this prayer, and there are three prayers here that we're given into. Notice at the conclusion of this prayer time, what does Jesus do?
Gets up, goes, does his work.
Is there any doubt in his mind what he's supposed to do?
At any point, it seems like he's got a moment of clarity.
I'm going to use the word resolute. At this moment, coming into the garden, we see this idea of question, this idea of possibility, this idea that there could be, God, what other options are there? But when 46 happens, there is a resolute personality to Jesus now that says, I have one job and I'm marching towards it. I'm not running away. I'm not even going to stay here and wait. Grab the disciples. Let's go, because we have a place we need to be. I think at this moment, through this time of prayer, Jesus finds, maybe it's peace, but he finds something that drives him towards the cross. But I think that scene in Luke's account, Luke talks about an angel appearing. And in Luke's gospel, it is not uncommon for angels to appear to bring assistance to people or to bring messages. What do you think the angel did for Jesus?
I can't help but think maybe
Just a little while longer.
He gave him strength.
Strength. What else? We don't know. We're not told precisely what the angel does. So we're just, this is a moment of conjecture here, but what else do you think?
Could have been some comfort.
Maybe some comfort. My father hadn't really forgotten, hadn't really lost sight yet.
In our lives today, when we're facing something that's very difficult, having people around us that understand and encourage gives us a lot toward persevering.
Just a company of people, which brings us to what I don't want to jump ahead just yet, but I want to hold that thought, because that's the next point I want to come to. Before we jump to the people that should be present, though, we have this idea of Jesus in the garden, and I want to share just the question that I have is, how do we know if Jesus left Peter, James, and John and walked on a little ways further? The text says about a stone's throw away. How do we know what Jesus prayed? Well, was Luke making it up, or was Mark making it? No, probably what happened. By the way, why was Jesus in Jerusalem at this moment? The Passover. How many people would have been in Jerusalem for the Passover? Lots of people. There wouldn't have been enough room in the hotels for all of them. So if you're at Jerusalem for Passover and there ain't no room in the hotel and you don't have family that got a place for you to stay, where are you going to stay? You're going to camp on a hillside. Okay, so I'm going to have a question. Anyone here, when your kids were younger, maybe you were younger, do you remember traveling somewhere and when you got to a place, Dad would just pitch a tent on the side of the road? Is there anyone that remembers that? Linda's got one. Okay.
You want me to tell about it?
Well, no, you don't have to tell about it, but I'm kind of shocked. No one, everyone remembers hotels, or did you just didn't travel?
Used to just be, there used to just be a lot of places where you could pull off like that.
I remember it was, if I traveled with an older gentleman, let's say, well, it was always the oldest guy got the cab of the pickup truck, and you'd put a rock in each door so that the lights would turn off. And I remember as a kid, I slept on the ground. And now I do know that if Mama was traveling, Mama got the car and everyone else slept outside. So there was this hierarchy of the way things worked. But if you're traveling to Jerusalem, there's a whole bunch of people. Jesus isn't the only person on the mountain right now. There's a whole bunch of people, and there's a good chance that from me to Laura, someone else has their tent pitched, and they're over there, and maybe the disciples are a stone's throw. Well, if Josh is throwing a stone, it's going to make it to Roger. I'm not a good thrower, but some people might throw a stone that might hit, let's say, somewhere in the gym area. So you'd say, well, there might be some distance here. But Jesus is on the ground praying. Chances are he's praying out loud. Chances are he's not mumbling this.
Maybe his voice carried.
And maybe his voice carried. So what's the possibility then? Or it becomes far more probable that people who are sitting around Jesus are able to hear what he's saying. Now, coming to where Betty was taking us a moment ago. Sometimes having a company, sometimes having someone around provides an extra source of comfort, a place that says, okay, I can do this because I have people with me. Like I said, Luke tells us that an angel was that role that filled in that place of comfort. But what I struggle with is who was there who could have and should have provided the place of comfort? Peter, James, and John. And if you go a little ways further, you got the rest of the disciples, but particularly the three closest. Peter, who had just before this at the dinner table said what to Jesus?
Never deny you. I will die.
Die for you. John, who we know is the beloved disciple, who's the one who Jesus looks to and says, this is my mother, take care of her. So these aren't like some shabby friends. I mean, these are the people that are closest to him who have just swore their allegiance to him. They're emotionally exhausted. They can't help but fall asleep. There are three prayers. Jesus goes and prays. He comes down, and then, and this is about verse 40, or this is the Matthew 26 section. He comes, he finds them sleeping. Couldn't you keep watch with me for 1 hour? Man, that's a long prayer, but hey, there's nothing wrong with that. And then he says, watch and pray that you won't fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He goes a second time and prays. He comes back. I'm going to guess he leaves them sleeping in verse 43. Verse 44, left them, goes back and prays a third time. And then when he comes back in verse 45, he says, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come.
It's interesting that in Mark's account, he specifically speaks to Simon. And he says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Actually, I have this question coming up, but I'll go ahead and ask it now. Knowing the future of them abandoning Jesus, would this time of prayer have helped? We have the ability to know what's about to happen. What if the disciples had been able to stay awake? And what if they had spent the time in prayer? Would it have made a difference?
I think it would have made a difference for them. Maybe not a difference in the ultimate outcome, but certainly for them. Prayer always makes a difference.
He wouldn't have told them to pray upon temptation. It wouldn't have done any good. Absolutely. I think going back, especially in 39, that's what we see in 39.
Yeah.
The first thing that stood out to me is that Jesus went out and you. It's a good lesson to learn for us. This is not something he just did because all of a sudden he's in a time of need. This is nothing he didn't know what to do. But he went as he usually does. He went to be with Father. He went to talk to the Father about what's about to happen. The cool thing in this to me is when he talks about, if you're going to take that from me, he is making it clear to us, I believe, that I am human. I came, yes, I am the Son of God. I am the Son. Yes, I came as a human being to live. I was brought into this earth just like you. I sat in that womb for 9 or 10 months. I came out of there. I grew up just like you did. I went through all the punishments, all the rejoicing that you did. I've done it all. And now my human flesh is screaming out, take it from me. But no, that's not me. That's not who I am. And I'm showing you. As humans, I'm showing you there is another way. And it's him that's doing it. It's not falling to the flesh. And he's making it perfectly clear to us right there. It's just powerful to see that he was human. And sometimes I think we start by how critical that is. Even when he was raised from the dead, he was human. When he went to deliver that blood, he was human. And it's just that's something we miss out on, I think, and it's critical that we went to so much trouble to put that out.
I love, for those of you online, if you couldn't hear Steve's comment, it was basically the commonality that he visited this place often. This was not uncommon, which we talked about at the very beginning. That's why Judas knew where he's going. Judas was well aware of the location because Jesus was so habitually there that it mattered. And then secondly, this shows us the humanity of Jesus. This shows us that it's not like Jesus walks towards the cross. Now, granted, I think after 46, I think he's got his eyes set. I think there's nothing that's distracting. But I think in this moment, we see that it's really, I don't want to do this. There are some other ways. If there's another way, let's figure this out. But after the comfort that comes from God, after the power that comes, that is given to Jesus in this time of prayer, he knows what's happening now. Looking back at the disciples now, he reproves them on both the first and the third account. Basically, could you not stay awake? Could you not last a little while longer? They've fallen asleep. And instead of sleeping, you're supposed to be spending this time in prayer. Did they not know how much Jesus needed them? Did they not know the emotional support that they were at this moment? Had they lost sight of that? Surely.
I think that's a lot of what was going on. You know, Steve was talking about that human element. There are so many human elements going on here. They have just been told that one of them is going to betray. Peter has been told, and he in the apostles' eyes and in his eyes probably, he thought he was the rock. I'm not going to deny you. And Christ tells him, you're going to deny me 3 times. You see all these human elements entering in here and how they handle it. And Jesus says, pray. And that's how you handle it. And I don't want to get into what you're going into next, but you see the results of why, not depending on God and praying to God to get you through this hurt you.
Let's talk about that human element for a moment. By the way, those online, if you could, I think you could hear Chris, but if you couldn't, this human element, let's think about that for a moment. So where had they just come from? Where they have just retired from somewhere onto the mountain. Where were they at?
They've been in the upper room for the Passover.
And the Passover, is it a small meal or a big meal?
Big meal.
Big meal.
It's a pretty decent meal. You're not going to leave there hungry. And by the way, what were they drinking when they had the Passover meal? Wine.
And they got a foot massage. So they were probably really good and relaxed.
I love it. I love it. So let's just think about this for a minute. You got a full belly, you've had a couple of glasses of wine, and you had a foot massage. Where are you going to be?
Exhausted.
I'm going to be falling asleep. I cannot fault them on a human standard for what they're doing because I probably would be doing the same thing. That's what when we look at this, and it would be easy to say, oh, I can't believe the disciples fell asleep. But you throw 3 glasses of wine down a full belly and then come back and tell me if you could stay awake for the night. Oh, which by the way, it's already late. It's past bedtime. What this tells me, go ahead.
What if you were told that you were fixing to go to the cross yourself? You think you'd go to sleep then?
Why is it that Jesus is able to pray and the disciples aren't? I think what I see in this, at least for an application, is the reality of what Jesus says. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The weakness of the flesh should never be underestimated. Jesus accepts God's will. That's where we come in verse 46. The angel came giving him strength in Luke's account. And now he seems strong.
He's totally alone in this.
Mm.
He's totally alone. There's no one with him at this point. I mean, Peter will follow and John will be there, but they're not really with him. He is alone.
So to look at this time, I guess the question I would ask, you're looking at this entire situation, and it brings me to this idea on prayer. How do we respond when God answers no? Have we ever prayed for God to solve a problem in our life? To heal, to provide, to whatever. And God's answer is no. Some people turn in moments like that and they say, well, there must not be a God, because a God wouldn't do that. But here we have an account where the Son of God, God himself incarnate, pleads to the other half or the other portion of himself to find another way. And the answer is, this is the way. So how do we respond when our pleas to God are answered with, this is the way? My last question for us is, what lesson can we learn about faith and patience in this story?
We got to trust God that he knows what's best for us, even if the answer is no, and be obedient and just follow after his heart and just keep trusting.
And isn't that hard sometimes? What else? Or anyone else? There might not be another what, but it might be a who. Who else?
Romans says, Romans 12, have joy in tribulation. There is no happiness in this life because of the flesh, but the Spirit brings joy, which is different from happiness. He wasn't happy with his circumstances, but he had joy because the Spirit said, I'm going back to the Father. It's more than a man wants to die after that judgment. We've got to look at it from the standpoint that as life goes on, we're moving toward eternity with God, which is far better blessing, and it should bring joy in our hearts. We don't anticipate it, but it's coming.
It's coming for us all.
You know, there's one other point in this we've sort of, it's probably going to come up later, but Greg was saying Christ was alone, all alone. And he had the forethought to know exactly what was going to happen later. And he was unjustly accused, and he knew this, that I have not sinned. but I'm bearing all the sins of humanity. And that's another element in there that he went ahead and did what the Father said.
He was alone physically, but it wasn't alone spiritually. That's the only hope we have in Christ. We're alone in this world except for brothers and buddies that bring us comfort and joy. But initially, it's between us and God.
And even in the moments of life where we have good friends, we have good family, there are always moments where we're the only ones that walk that road. And in those moments, we have to trust that we're walking with someone.
I think as I've studied it more and more, we live in this new society. And it's not all about me. It's about God's will. And it's about who can I influence? Not me, but he can through me. So I think that in this situation, he realized it's not about my physical life. It's about the spiritual. It's not all about me.
I don't think Jesus was never taken by surprise. All this known to him from the beginning. He never forgot that. We kind of talked about it going to the cross, did it that way at a certain point. And he came here instead, never slowed down. He knew exactly what he was getting into, and he had. I think he's letting us see that this isn't about putting your fires out, even though we hear him asking God or pleading with God to take this away. I don't read that as this personally. I see it more as him just making the statement that, boy, take this away from me. As a human being, I'd like you to take this away, but that's not even my thought, Father. It's your will that counts. I think he's more announcing something to us that fires are coming, pain's coming, it's here. But just like the angels proclaimed when they came to us and said, behold, I bring you tidings of what? Great joy. Period. Here it is. He's here on earth now. Great joy is here. Yeah, you're going to face a lot of misery, physical pain, physical heartaches, whatnot. But you have great joy, and it cannot be taken from you. It's important to remember that. There's a big difference. It's not just about we're going to be with him someday. He's already in us. There's joy in that. And we can't forget that. Once that's there, it's like everything, the perspective on the rest of life. It's knowing about the tragedies that are going to hit before they do, and who we are, even after that happens, because of who we are with him in us. And so those things hit us in a totally different way than they would had he not already been here for us, had he not already finished that. So we get to face these challenges with a different joy that's inside of us. Physically it hurts here on earth, but we know the difference. And we respond to those things differently. It's not how do we react to this now. It's maybe Jesus has said it's going to change who we are, and we take those challenges differently. But it's about going to him in that way of relationship. Like Jesus points out, this is usual for me. It's not different. This is what I do. It's not because of thee. It's because of who I am and who he is. I want to know him more daily. And he knows better than I.
I'm going to use your phrasing. I'm going to add a word to it. We respond to the situations of life, what all's going on. We as Christians should, in the way Jesus did. It's not my will, Father. It's yours. Thank you all very much for your attention, for your conversation. For those of you online, thank you for joining us today. We will be transitioning over for worship, so we'll see you shortly. God bless.